The middle way, the most misunderstood idea in Buddhism. Act 1. The misconception. If I asked you what the middle way means, you'd probably say something like, balance, don't go to extremes, find the middle ground. And for 2,500 years, that's been the most common misunderstanding in all of Buddhism. The Buddha didn't say, eat moderately instead of feasting or fasting. He said something much stranger, that both approaches are wrong in their very nature. And then he pointed to a third option that neither side could even see. Today, we're going to recover what the middle way actually means. Not the motivational poster version, the real thing. And it's far more radical than everything in moderation. We'll move through 4 layers, each one deeper than the last. The middle way applied to the body, to the world, to the self, and finally, to a pattern that, once you see it, changes how you approach every difficult question in your life. But first, let's be honest about what most people think the middle way is. Because the misunderstanding isn't random. It makes perfect sense, and that's exactly why it's so hard to shake. Here's how the middle way usually gets explained. You've probably heard some version of this. The Buddha was a prince. He lived in luxury. Then he tried extreme asceticism, starving himself, sleeping on nails, the whole picture. Neither worked. So he found the middle, a balanced approach. Not too much, not too little. The Goldilocks path. And there's a famous metaphor that seems to confirm this perfectly. The Buddha compared spiritual practice to tuning a stringed instrument. Too tight, the string breaks. Too loose, no sound. You want the middle, just right. Sounds like moderation. Sounds like common sense. Sounds like something your grandmother could have told you without meditating under a tree for 6 years. And that should be your first clue that something's been lost in translation. Because if the middle way was simply, don't go to extremes, why would it need a Buddha to discover it? Why would he call it the path to awakening and unbinding? Why would 5 monks who had abandoned him in disgust sit down, listen, and within weeks become fully enlightened? Everything in moderation doesn't do that. The problem isn't just that the popular version is incomplete. It's that it flattens something precise into something vague. And once it's flat, you can't see what's actually there. Let me show you what I mean. When you hear middle way, you probably picture a spectrum, a line with one extreme on the left, one on the right, and the correct answer somewhere in the middle. Like a thermostat, too hot, too cold, find the right temperature. That's moderation, and moderation is a perfectly fine idea. Aristotle built an entire ethical system around it. The golden mean, find the virtuous midpoint between excess and deficiency. It's elegant, it's practical. But it's not what the Buddha taught. The Buddhist scholar-monk Thanissaro Bhikkhu, one of the most careful translators working with the Pali text today, has pointed out something that changes everything. The Buddha does not say the middle way lies between 2 extremes. He says it avoids 2 extremes. That distinction sounds small. It isn't. Between means you're still on the same line. You've just moved to a different point. The framework stays intact. Avoids means something else entirely. Sometimes you avoid extremes by finding a moderate point on the continuum. Yes, that happens. But sometimes, and this is the radical part, you avoid extremes by stepping off the continuum altogether, by rejecting the framework that created the extremes in the first place. That's not moderation. That's a completely different move. And here's what makes it stranger still. Look at what the Buddha actually prescribed as the middle way. Right effort. described in the texts as 4 forms of intense exertion: generating desire, endeavoring, activating persistence, upholding intent. SN 45.8. That's not moderate effort. That's the language of total commitment, right concentration. 4 levels of meditative absorption called jhana, each deeper and more refined than the last. SN 45.8. Not sit quietly for 10 minutes. Profound, sustained, transformative states of mind. And the outcomes, not a balanced life. The text says, stilling, direct knowledge, self-awakening, unbinding. SN 56.11. Unbinding, nibbana, the complete cessation of suffering. These are radical outcomes, and they come from what we've been told is a teaching about moderation. Something doesn't add up. Either the Buddha was confused about his own teaching, or we've been reading it wrong. There's a line from the Thai forest master Ajahn Mahabhuwa that cuts right through the confusion. He said, "The middle way of craving is right in the middle of a pillow." What he means is this: if you let craving define the extremes, then craving's idea of the middle is wherever craving is most comfortable. That's not the middle way. That's the path of least resistance dressed up in spiritual language. The middle way isn't about comfort. It isn't about splitting the difference. And it isn't about finding a position that offends no one. Thanissaro puts it directly. Even though the precepts, the ethical guidelines at the base of the path, are moderate in their strictness, the commitment they demand is extreme. The middle way, he says, is not a middling way. So if the middle way isn't moderation, what is it? That's what we're going to find out. And the answer doesn't live in one place. It lives in 4 layers, 4 contexts where the Buddha applied the same move, each time at a deeper level. We'll start where he started, with the body, with a young man who nearly killed himself trying to find the truth, and what he discovered when he stopped. Act 2, Layer 1. The body before the Buddha was the Buddha. He was Siddhattha Gautama, and he tried both extremes in a single lifetime. The luxury is the part everyone knows, so we won't linger there. A prince raised behind palace walls, shielded from old age, sickness and death. Every comfort available, every desire met before it fully formed. What matters for our story is what happened after he left, because Siddhattha didn't ease into spiritual practice. He threw himself into the most extreme asceticism his culture had to offer. And in ancient India, that meant something far beyond what we'd imagine today. He reduced his food to almost nothing. Some accounts say a single grain of rice, a single sesame seed per day. He held his breath until pain shot through his skull. He slept on thorns. He sat motionless in the scorching sun and the freezing cold. For 6 years, and it nearly killed him. The texts describe him as a skeleton wrapped in skin, so thin that when he touched his stomach, he could feel his spine from the front. MN 36. He had 5 companions during this period, 5 monks who admired his commitment, who believed that whoever pushed the hardest would break through first. In their framework, suffering was the price of truth. More suffering, more truth. Then Siddhattha did something unforgivable. He ate. A woman named Sujata offered him rice milk, and he accepted it. His body began to recover, and his 5 companions, the only spiritual friends he had, looked at him with disgust and walked away. The ascetic Gautama has become luxurious, they said. He has given up the struggle. MN 36. Think about that moment. He's been striving for 6 years. He's lost everything: his palace, his family, his status. Now he loses the only people who respected his search. He's completely alone, and is precisely here, abandoned, somewhere between the luxury he'd rejected and the asceticism that had failed, that he sits down under a tree and awakens. Now, pay attention to what happens next, because the sequence matters more than most people realize. After his awakening, the Buddha has a choice about whom to teach first. He chooses those 5 monks, the very ones who abandoned him. He walks to the deer park at Isipatana, and when they see him coming, they agree among themselves, "Don't stand up, don't greet him. He's given up." But something in his bearing changes their minds. They rise, they offer him a seat, and the very first teaching he gives, the very first words of the newly awakened Buddha to any audience, are about the middle way, SN 56.11. Not about suffering, not about enlightenment, not about meditation or karma or rebirth. The middle way, that's where he starts, and he starts there because of who he's talking to. These 5 monks are extreme ascetics. They already despise indulgence. They don't need convincing on that front. What they need to hear is that their path is also a dead end. That self-mortification is, in the Buddha's words, painful, ignoble, and unprofitable. SN 56.11. Notice the asymmetry. When the Buddha describes sensual indulgence, he uses 5 terms: base, vulgar, common, ignoble, unprofitable. When he describes self-mortification, he uses only 3: painful, ignoble, unprofitable. He hits their extreme with fewer words, not because it's less wrong, but because these monks need surgical precision, not a lecture. They already know indulgence is base. What they don't know, what no one has told them, is that their self-punishment is equally unprofitable. And then comes the critical line. Avoiding both of these extremes, he says, the middle way realized by the Tathagata, producing vision, producing knowledge, leads to stilling, to direct knowledge, to self-awakening, to unbinding, SN 56.11. The Pali word there, patipada, is often translated as way or path, but it literally means a mode of progress, a way of walking. The middle way isn't a place you arrive at. It's not a destination between 2 points. It's a way you move. And what is this way of moving? The Buddha answers immediately. Precisely this noble eightfold path: right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. SN 56.11. The Pali uses an emphatic particle, ayameva. Precisely this, exactly this, nothing else. The middle way is the eightfold path, not a metaphor for it, not a prelude to it, identical with it. Now, here's where the popular understanding starts to crack. There's a well-known sutta about a monk named Sona, A.N. 6.55. Sona was earnest, perhaps too earnest. He practiced walking meditation so intensely that the soles of his feet split open and bled. The walking path was stained with blood, as if cattle had been slaughtered there. The Buddha came to him and asked a question. "Sona, before you ordained, you were skilled at playing the vana, weren't you?" "Yes, Lord." "When the strings were too tight, was the vana in tune?" "No, Lord." "When the strings were too loose, was it in tune?" "No, Lord." "But when the strings were neither too tight nor too loose, established right on pitch, was the vana in tune?" "Yes, Lord." "In the same way, Sona, determine the right pitch for your persistence." And Sona did. He adjusted his effort, and he attained arahantship, full awakening. AN 6.55. If you stopped here, you'd walk away thinking, moderation confirmed, not too tight, not too loose, the Goldilocks path. But listen more carefully, A vana in tune is not a vana with moderate tension. It's a vana with exactly the right tension. For the specific instrument, for the specific string, for the specific note you need to play. Right on pitch is not somewhere in the middle. It's the one point out of infinite possibilities where the instrument actually works. That's precision, not compromise. Sona's problem wasn't that he was trying too hard. It was that his effort was miscalibrated, intense in a way that destroyed the very instrument he needed. Bleeding feet don't produce insight. The Buddha didn't tell him to try less. He told him to try right. And this is where the entire moderation reading collapses, because if the middle way were about doing things moderately, you'd expect the Buddha's path to look moderate. It doesn't. Right effort, the sixth factor of the Eightfold Path, is described in the texts as 4 forms of vigorous exertion: generating desire, endeavoring, activating persistence, upholding and exerting intent for the sake of abandoning unwholesome states and cultivating wholesome ones. SN 45.8. Read that list. That's not try a little bit. That's full mobilization. Right concentration, the 8th factor, involves the 4 jhanas. These are not relaxation states. The first jhana alone involves rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. By the 4th jhana, even these have been refined away, leaving pure equanimity and mindfulness. SN 45.8. Monks who master these states describe them as the most profound experiences of their lives. The texts compare the precision of discernment to splitting a horsehair already divided into 7 strands. SN 46.45. That's not vague. That's not casual. That's the opposite of take it easy. And the outcomes, again, not a more balanced life. Stilling, direct knowledge, self-awakening, unbinding, the permanent end of suffering. SN 56.11. So what's going on? How can a teaching be called the middle way while demanding this level of intensity? The answer is that we've been using the wrong definition of middle. Thanissaro Bhikkhu makes a distinction that unlocks the entire teaching. There are, he says, 2 kinds of middle in the Buddha's path. The first is a middle of moderation, a point on a continuum. Some aspects of the path do work this way. The Verna string, the ethical precepts. You calibrate, you find the appropriate degree. But the second kind, the one that makes the middle way genuinely radical, is what he calls a middle of appropriate attention. And this doesn't work on a continuum at all. You don't find a midpoint. You leave the continuum entirely. The question isn't how much self-mortification is the right amount. The question is, why am I assuming that truth requires punishment? The question isn't how much pleasure should I allow. The question is, why am I letting craving define the options? The middle way, at this level, isn't an answer on the existing spectrum. It's a refusal to accept the spectrum as the only place answers can live. That's the first layer, the one most people encounter and stop at. The middle way applied to how you practice. Not too indulgent, not too punishing. But even that not too isn't a compromise. It's precision. And sometimes it's a departure from the line altogether. But the Buddha didn't stop there, because he applied the same logic to a much harder question, one about the nature of reality itself. Ace T3, Layer 2, the world. In the first layer, the middle way was about practice, about what you do with your body and your effort. The Buddha looked at 2 extremes of behavior and said, neither one, not a compromise between them, but a precise path that refuses to let either extreme set the terms. Now he does something far more ambitious. He applies the same logic, not to how you live, but to what exists. There's a sutta that doesn't get nearly the attention it deserves. It's short, it's dense, and it may be the most philosophically powerful teaching in the entire Pali Canon. A monk named Kachanagota comes to the Buddha with a deceptively simple question. To what extent is there right view? SLN 12.15. In other words, what does it mean to see correctly? The Buddha's answer moves in 3 steps, and if you follow them carefully, you'll see the middle way operating at a level most people never encounter. Step 1, he says, this world, kakana, generally leans on a polarity, existence and non-existence, SN 12.15. Things either exist or they don't. Something is real or it isn't. Self or no self. Permanent or nothing. We think in binaries. Step 2. But for one who sees with right discernment the arising of the world as it actually is, non-existence doesn't occur to him. And for one who sees with right discernment the cessation of the world as it actually is, existence doesn't occur to him. SN 12.15. Step 3. Everything exists. That is one extreme. Everything doesn't exist. That is the second extreme. Avoiding both of these extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma by the middle, S, and SN 12.15. And that middle, in this context, is dependent origination. Things arise when conditions come together. Things cease when conditions fall apart. Not permanent, not nothing. Arising and passing, dependent on causes. Now, if your eyes glazed over just slightly, I don't blame you. This sounds abstract. Existence versus non-existence feels like a problem for philosophy seminars, not for someone sitting on a couch on a Tuesday evening. So let me make it concrete. Think of a storm. Is there a storm? Yes. You can feel the wind. The rain hits your face. Lightning cracks overhead. A storm can destroy a house, reroute a flight, change the course of your day. It's real. It has effects. You wouldn't say there is no storm while standing in the middle of one. But now, where is the storm? Can you point to it? Can you draw a line around it and say, this is where the storm begins, and this is where it ends? You can't, because storm is what we call a particular pattern of conditions, temperature, pressure, moisture, wind, coming together in a specific way. Remove the conditions, and there's no storm. But the storm isn't separate from those conditions either. It's not hiding somewhere, waiting to exist. A storm is a nothing. It can flatten a city. But a storm isn't a thing. It has no fixed essence, no core identity apart from the conditions that produce it. The Buddha is saying, that's how everything works. Your anger isn't nothing. It has real effects. But your anger isn't a thing. It arises from conditions, and when those conditions change, it ceases. The economy, a friendship, a nation, your body, every phenomenon you've ever encountered, real enough to shape your life, but not a fixed entity that exists independently of the conditions that produce it. Everything exists as fixed independent things is one extreme. Nothing exists, nihilism, everything is illusion, is the other extreme. Both are wrong. And the middle isn't a compromise between them. It's a completely different way of understanding what real means. Real, but not fixed. Present, but not permanent. Arising, but not from nothing. Ceasing, but not into nothing. That's dependent origination. And in SN 12:15, the Buddha explicitly identifies it as the middle way. Stop for a moment and notice what just happened. In the first layer, the middle way was practical advice, how to calibrate your effort, how to practice without destroying yourself or indulging yourself. Important, useful, but contained. Here, the middle way has become a statement about the nature of reality. Not just don't go to extremes in your practice, but the very structure of existence is neither permanent nor empty. The same pattern. Avoiding two extremes not by finding a midpoint, but by rejecting the framework, now operates at the level of everything that exists. The middle way just went from a lifestyle recommendation to an ontology, from a practice tip to a description of how the universe works. And this teaching was so philosophically potent that it echoed for centuries. Around 400 years after the Buddha, a thinker named Nagarjuna founded what became one of the most influential schools in all of Buddhist philosophy, the Madhyamaka school. The name itself means the middle way school, and in his masterwork, the Madhyamaka Karika, there is exactly one sutta from the Pali Canon that Nagarjuna cites by name. It's this one, SN 12.15, the Kachanagota Sutta. One scholar called Nagarjuna's entire work a commentary on this single teaching. But that's a story for another time. What matters now is this. The philosophical power of the middle way was not a modern invention. It was recognized almost from the beginning. So, 2 layers in, the middle way applied to practice, not a midpoint but precision, sometimes leaving the continuum entirely. The middle way applied to reality, not things exist or things don't exist, but a third option that neither pole can see. The same move, the same refusal to accept the terms of the debate. And now the Buddha turns that move inward, to the most personal question of all. Who are you? Act 4, Layer 3, the self. Practice. Reality. Now, the question you actually care about. Does the self exist? It's the question that sits underneath everything else, underneath your relationships, your ambitions, your fears about death, your sense of meaning. If the self is real, then life is personal. Your suffering matters, your choices matter, you matter. If the self isn't real, then what? Nothing matters? Everything you felt was an illusion. These are the stakes. And the Buddha knew it. There's a scene in the Pali Canon that is, to my mind, one of the most extraordinary moments in all of religious literature, and almost no one talks about it. A wanderer named Vacchagotta comes to the Buddha and asks a direct question. Is there a self? Asceticism 44.10. The Buddha is silent. Vacchagotta tries again. Then is there no self? The Buddha is silent. Vacchagotta gets up and leaves. Now, after he's gone, the Buddha's attendant Ananda, who has been sitting there the whole time, asks the obvious question. Why didn't you answer? And the Buddha explains, if I had said there is a self, I would have been siding with those who believe in a permanent, unchanging soul, the eternalists. If I had said there is no self, I would have been siding with those who believe that nothing survives, that death is total annihilation, the annihilationists. And here's the part that matters. It would have confused Vacchagotta further. He would have thought, I used to have a self, and now I don't. S.N. 44.10. Both answers would have been wrong, not because the truth is somewhere in the middle, but because the question itself, does the self exist, yes or no, is the wrong question. It assumes a framework the Buddha refuses to enter. Notice, Ananda is right there. Vajragota is gone. This is a private moment between teacher and student. If the Buddha secretly held the view that there is no self, this was the perfect opportunity to say so. He could have said, "Look, Ananda, between us, there's no self. I just couldn't tell Vajragota because he wasn't ready." He didn't say that. He explained why neither answer works. And this isn't an isolated moment. There's a teaching in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Sabbasava Sutta, where the Buddha lists ways of thinking that lead to suffering. And among them, he includes both "I have a self" and "I have no self," MN2. Read that again. Both positions, self exists and self doesn't exist, are listed as wrong views, as what the text calls a thicket of views, a wilderness of views, a contortion of views, not liberation, entanglement. This is the middle way applied to the most intimate question a human being can ask, and it works exactly the same way as the first two layers. In practice, indulgence versus mortification. The Buddha doesn't pick a side, he steps off the line. In reality, permanent existence versus total non-existence. The Buddha doesn't pick a side, he steps off the line. In selfhood, I have a self versus I have no self. Same move, same refusal, same departure from a framework that forces you into one of two wrong answers. But then, and this is where it gets genuinely subtle, if the Buddha doesn't say the self exists and doesn't say the self doesn't exist, what does he say? He says, this is not self. Not there is no self. Not self is an illusion. He looks at each component of experience, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness, the five aggregates. And he says one by one, this is not self. This is not self. This is not self. SN 22.59. Do you hear the difference? There is no self is a metaphysical claim, a statement about ultimate reality. This is not self is a practical instruction, a tool for letting go. It's the difference between a philosopher declaring love doesn't exist and a therapist saying this feeling you're holding on to, it's not who you are. You can put it down. One closes a question, the other opens a door. Thanissaro Bhikkhu has argued, and this is his interpretation, one that not all scholars share, though the textual evidence is substantial, that the Buddha uses both self and not self as strategies rather than as metaphysical positions. You use the concept of self when it's helpful, when it builds agency, responsibility, the motivation to practice. You use not self when it's helpful, when it breaks attachment, dissolves identification with what's painful, creates a space to let go. Neither is the final truth. Both are tools in service of a goal, the end of suffering, MN2, S, N22.59. This reading is debated. Some scholars argue the Buddha does make an ontological claim about the non-existence of self. That's a legitimate position with its own textual support. But what's not debatable is the silence in SN 44.10 and the double rejection in MN2. Whatever the Buddha's ultimate position, he refused repeatedly, explicitly, on the record, to let the question be framed as a binary. If you watched the first video on this channel, the one about the ego, you might remember that we looked at three traditions fighting over the same word. Freud built a system around the ego as mediator between instinct and society. Jung saw the ego as a necessary but limited mask over a much deeper self. The Buddha looked at both and said, "You're arguing about the furniture in a house that may not have walls." That video was about the fight. This is about the move that transcends it. The middle way, applied to the self, doesn't tell you who you are. It doesn't tell you who you aren't. it does something more unsettling and more liberating. It takes the question itself, the question you've been carrying your whole life, and suggests that the way you've been framing it is what's keeping you stuck. Not self exists versus self doesn't exist. Not a position between the two. A way of moving that doesn't need to answer the question in order to end the suffering that the question generates. 3 layers now. The body, where the middle way is precision, not moderation. Where you tune the instrument to exactly the right pitch, not to some comfortable halfway point. The world, where the middle way is dependent origination, where everything is real enough to matter, but impermanent enough to release. Where exists and doesn't exist are both too crude for what's actually happening. The self, where the middle way is silence in the face of a question that demands a binary answer. Where this is not self, is a door, not a verdict. 3 domains, 3 debates, and 3 times the same move. But we haven't named that move yet. Not precisely. Not in a way you can carry with you. That's next. Act 5. The pattern. Now, step back with me for a moment. 3 times we've watched the Buddha encounter a debate where 2 sides face each other across a divide. Practice. Indulgence versus self-denial. The world. Everything exists versus nothing exists. The self. I have a self versus I have no self. And 3 times he made the exact same move. He didn't pick a side. He didn't split the difference. He didn't find a compromise that borrows a little from each. He stepped off the line entirely and pointed to something that neither side, locked in their opposition, could see. That's the middle way, not a point between 2 extremes, a departure from the framework that created them. Thanissaro Bhikkhu names this distinction with a clarity that deserves attention. He identifies 2 kinds of middle operating in the Buddha's teachings. The first he calls the middle of moderation. This one works on a continuum. The Venus string, too tight, too loose. Find the right tension. The ethical precepts, not impossibly strict, not lax. You calibrate, you adjust. This is the middle that most people recognize, and it's real. Parts of the path do work this way. But the second kind, the one the Buddha used again and again at the deepest levels, is what Thanissaro calls the middle of appropriate attention. And this one doesn't work on a continuum at all. When someone asks, does the self exist or not? The middle of moderation would say, well, partly. A little bit of self, a little bit of not self. That's not what the Buddha said. He said the question is wrongly framed. He refused the continuum. When the world is divided between everything is permanent and nothing is real. The middle of moderation would look for something semi-permanent. That's not what dependent origination says. It says, arising and ceasing dependent on conditions. A way of understanding that neither pole can generate. The second kind of middle doesn't find a position between the extremes. It dissolves the axis on which the extremes sit. And here's something worth pausing on. This wasn't an abstract philosophical exercise. It was a real intervention in a real debate. At the time of the Buddha, the Indian intellectual landscape was dominated by competing schools making extreme claims. The Jains taught that all action, even unintentional, generates karmic consequences. Step on an insect by accident, and you've created suffering. The logical conclusion, cease all activity. Some Jain ascetics starved themselves to death as a spiritual practice. On the other side, the Arjavakas, a school now largely forgotten, taught that actions have no moral consequences whatsoever. Everything is determined by fate. What you do doesn't matter. The logical conclusion, nothing you choose makes any difference. The Buddha looked at both positions and said, intentional actions have consequences. A. N 6.63. Not all actions intentional ones. Not no actions intentional ones. That single word, Siddhattha, intention, redrew the entire map. He didn't find a midpoint between everything you do matters cosmically and nothing you do matters at all. He changed what matters means. He moved the conversation to a place where neither school was standing. That's not moderation. That's a genuine philosophical intervention. One that, 25 centuries later, still hasn't been absorbed. There's a comparison that might sharpen this further, just for a moment. Most people, when they hear Middleway, instinctively think of Aristotle's golden mean. And the comparison seems obvious. Aristotle says, virtue lies between two vices. Courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between stinginess and extravagance. Find the midpoint. The Buddha says something that sounds similar, but operates completely differently. Aristotle asks, where is the virtuous point on this line? The Buddha asks, why are you standing on that line at all? Aristotle's method keeps the framework and adjusts your position within it. The Buddha's method, at its deepest, questions the framework itself. Both are brilliant. They're not the same move. So, if this is the pattern, what happens when you apply it beyond the canonical teachings? When you bring the same logic to questions the Buddha never directly addressed? I want to be transparent here. What follows is not something the Buddha taught. It's a contemporary extrapolation, applying the structural pattern we've uncovered to modern dilemmas. The logic is the same. The application is ours. Consider the question that haunts almost everyone at some point. Should I hold on to hope, or should I accept reality? You know the two sides. The optimists who insist you should never give up, visualize success, believe harder, and the realists, sometimes the cynics, who say stop deluding yourself, accept what's in front of you, surrender, hope versus acceptance. It feels like a spectrum with a forced choice. But what if the middle way move applies? What if both hold on to hope and surrender to reality are based on the same hidden assumption, that your well-being depends on what happens next, that the future is where your peace lives? The Buddha might say, you're both wrong about where to look, not because hope is bad or acceptance is bad, but because you've both agreed, without examining it, that your freedom depends on outcomes. And that agreement, that shared framework, is the thing to question. The closest canonical support is a teaching about two forms of craving for existence and craving for non-existence, where the middle way avoids both. ET 49. The structure is the same. The application to modern hope versus acceptance is ours. Or consider another dilemma familiar to this audience. Engagement versus detachment. Do you stay involved in the world, its politics, its problems, its noise, or do you withdraw into inner peace? The middle way pattern suggests the question is rigged. Both options assume that the world and your inner life are separate, that you must choose one at the expense of the other. What if the wiser move is to question that separation? These are not canonical teachings. They're the pattern, set loose. And I think the Buddha would approve of applying it, as long as we're honest about what we're doing. Here's what I want you to take from this. The middle way is not a philosophy of compromise. It's not be moderate. It's not find the balance. It's a pattern of attention. a way of noticing when you've been trapped by a question that only offers two answers, and discovering that the most important move is the one that neither side is making. Sometimes that move is calibration, the Venice string tuned to exactly the right pitch. Sometimes it's a departure, stepping off the line so completely that the old debate becomes irrelevant. The skill isn't knowing which move to make. The skill is seeing that you have the choice. ACT 6. Close. We started with a misunderstanding. The middle way means balance. Don't go to extremes. Find the comfortable middle, the kind of advice you could cross-stitch on a pillow. And, as Ajahn Mahabua warned, the kind of middle that craving would choose for itself. But that's not what the Buddha taught. Not even close. What he taught was a pattern, one he applied to the body, to reality, to the self. And each time, the move was the same. When two positions face each other and demand that you choose, look deeper, not for a compromise between them, for the assumption they share, for the framework neither side is questioning, for the exit that only appears when you stop accepting the terms of the debate. In practice, that meant tuning the instrument to exactly the right pitch, not tight, not loose, but precise. And it meant an eightfold path that demands total commitment, not casual moderation. In ontology, it meant dependent origination. Things arise from conditions and cease when conditions change. Not permanent, not nothing. A way of understanding reality that neither the eternalist nor the nihilist could reach from where they were standing. In selfhood, it meant silence. It meant refusing a question that the entire world assumed had only two answers, and offering instead a tool for freedom rather than a position to defend. And across all of it, the same signature, the same refusal, the same radical quiet confidence that the most important answer is often at a level no one is looking at yet. That's the middle way, not a philosophy of moderation, a pattern of liberation. And the word for it, Majjhima Patipada, doesn't mean the middle position. Patipada means a mode of progress, a way of walking. The middle way isn't a place, it's a practice, something you do again and again, every time life presents you with a choice that feels like a trap. The outcomes the Buddha promised for this path were not moderate outcomes. Stilling, direct knowledge, self-awakening, unbinding, SN 56.11, the complete end of suffering. You don't arrive there by splitting the difference. You arrive there by seeing clearly, by developing the kind of attention that can look at a debate and notice the invisible walls both sides are leaning against. That is an extraordinary skill, and like any skill, it can be developed. This is why this channel carries the name it does. Not because we teach moderation, not because we think wisdom means never taking a strong position, but because the most interesting answers in Buddhism, in philosophy, in science, in life, tend to live at a level that the obvious questions can't reach. The middle way is an invitation to look there. And so, the next time you find yourself caught between two options that both feel wrong, two sides of an argument where neither one satisfies, two paths forward where both seem to cost too much, consider the possibility that the right answer isn't between them. It's somewhere neither of them can see. And your job isn't to choose, it's to look deeper,